this next hour and a half. On that note, let's turn to our speakers on solidarity, politics, and political psychology. We have speakers from Warsaw, Istanbul, and Houston, Texas. But first, let's go to Rome, where we're joined from the St. Thomas Aquinas Angelicum University by the Reverend Professor Alejandro Crosthwaite, who leads courses on social teaching and political ethics and has a particular interest in culture, mass media, and film. Professor Crosthwaite, the floor is yours.
Unmute, please, Alejandro. We cannot hear you.
Alejandro, we're not hearing you.
Hear me?
Try again.
Okay.
I thought it was just me there for a moment, but please do go again.
Okay, thank you, Mark, again for the introduction. And so I will come from a Catholic social teaching perspective, and you'll see a little bit of my work that I'm working on several articles now. So although the official Latin text of Pope John the 23rd's 1961 social encyclical Mater et Magistra does not use the word socialization, official translations did. And for many commentators, the radical newness of Mater et Magistra, which is a document I'm working on right now, and its distinctive contribution to the development of Catholic social teaching lies in John the 23rd's acceptance of what he calls socialization. But it will not be until Pope John Paul II's last social encyclical, Centesimus Annus in 1991, that this phenomenon mentioned by John the 23rd will be termed globalization in Catholic social teaching. As one of the topics that we discuss in the seminar will be political psychology. And political psychology aims to understand precisely this socialization, this globalization, this interdependent relationships between individuals and contexts that are influenced by beliefs, motivation, perception, cognition, information processing, learning strategies, and attitude towards formation. Now, scientific and technical progress, greater productive efficiency, and a higher standard of living are among the many present-day factors which would seem to have contributed to this trend towards globalization, towards global socialization. At the same time, however, this multiplication and daily extension of forms of association, of socialization, of globalization, bring with it a multiplicity of restrictive laws and regulations in many aspects of human life, as Pope John the 23rd already foresaw in 1961. Pope Francis, in his address on occasion of the 2014 World Peace Day, affirmed, and I quote, "The many situations of inequality, poverty, and injustice," and in brackets, expanded worldwide by globalization, end of brackets, are signs not only of a profound lack of fraternity, but also of an absence of a culture of solidarity. New ideologies characterized by rampant individualism, egocentrism, and materialistic consumerism weaken social bonds, fueling that throwaway mentality which leads to contempt for and the abandonment of the weakest and those considered useless in society. In this way, human existence increasingly tends to resemble a mere quid pro quo, which is both pragmatic and selfish. End of quote. From the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, numbers 192 to 96, we learn that the notion of solidarity expresses the awareness that humanity has of constituting a greater and complex unity linked by an extraordinary interdependence. Solidarity is the cornerstone of the Church's social doctrine. Solidarity shows the intrinsic sociality of all human beings, explains the mutual dependence between peoples, and shows the need for mutual help for sustainable, integral human development, as well as care for the environment. This is particularly evident in today's world. The growing interdependence, globalization, or de facto solidarity seen in social life require a corresponding ethical foundation. And this foundation is the solidarity taught by social doctrine of the Church in its two complementary aspects as a social principle and as a moral virtue. As a social principle or political solidarity, It is one of those basic criteria which must preside over the construction of society and which serves to judge its righteousness, the righteousness of a society. Solidarity as a political virtue cannot be exchanged for pure emotion or feeling, but must be a firm and persevering determination to always act in favor of the common good. A profound formation, therefore, in political solidarity is needed, particularly in today's society, strongly imbued with individualism, and a serious decision to practice it in every social sphere, in the family, in the local community, at work, in intergenerational relationships. Political solidarity also requires that people recognize their debt to society, that is, to other people, and decide to collaborate with commitment to the development of society, of other people, as well as in view of future generations, that is, with intergenerational solidarity. In light of the gospel, solidarity reaches its highest peaks and tends to assimilate itself into charity, into love, that is, into total gratuity and to the full gift of oneself to others, following the example of our Lord Jesus Christ, as Pope Benedict XVI explained in Caritas in Veritate. As we attempt to emerge from the current global crisis of the pandemic, Pope Francis has offered us in Fratelli Tutti, his latest encyclical, his reflections on how we might do this, reminding us of the words of the Director General of the World Health Organization and the President of the European Commission, and I quote, "None of us will be safe until everyone is safe," end of quote. This is not the first time Pope Francis has spoken about our interconnectedness and responsibility towards one another as one human family sharing a common home. His previous social encyclical, published 5 years ago, Laudato Si', was a call to understand how the actions we take, the choices we make, and our very lifestyles were threatening all forms of life on this planet as we continue to push past planetary boundaries. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Pope Francis once again continued to elaborate on these thoughts of interdependence and interconnectivity, of socialization, and the relationship between our excesses, our individualism, our nationalisms, and the suffering we see around us. In the post-synodal document on the Amazons, Pope Francis states that, and I quote, "Only together would we heal this wounded world. Only by transforming, converting into a culture of care, of responsibility, of harmony, of listening, of solidarity, would we emerge from this crisis stronger," end of quote. Fratelli Tutti speaks of solidarity and fraternity. It reminds us to think in terms of that universal common good, to engage in an economy that, and I quote, "is an integral part of a political, social, cultural, and popular program," end of quote. It continues and deepens this reflection on the connection between how we treat the earth and how we treat each other, environmental ecology and human ecology, by bringing us ever closer to our own role and responsibility in how we treat our neighbor. Who is our neighbor, he asks, referring to the parable of the Good Samaritan, only to answer that it is not about the other, it is about us. We must be neighbor to the other. This is the true meaning of solidarity. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis challenges us once again to step out of our dangerous trends of building walls, of self-protectionism, nationalism, and isolationism. He calls on the multilateral institutions, on politicians, on governments, but also on common individuals to form a new kind of human community. He invites us to hope because, as he says, and I quote, "Hope is bold," and to allow ourselves to be open to the world around us, because it is in the richness of our diversity and the multitude of voices and ideas that we build peace together. At times, very political, Pope Francis does not shy away in Fratelli Tutti from identifying all the ways in which we have not been good neighbors, not been brothers and sisters, shown solidarity to other nations, other peoples, and especially the excluded in our own societies. One word comes back so many times in Fratelli Tutti, it is difficult to count, like a contemplative mantra throughout the text. Love, love, love of neighbor, love of people, love of culture, social love, political love, fraternal love. Love is the verb form of the noun solidarity. As he names the clouds that hang over our world, he shares with us how to chase them away and how to imagine a new world together. But what is clear throughout this reading is that new systems must be imagined, new ideas must be considered, new paths must be built. And the only way this will happen is if we open our hearts and act together for justice, dignity, solidarity, and the common good. Peace, shalom, will only be possible, and I quote, on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. End of quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Crosthwaite. Maybe one question to you just before I move on to the next speaker. Do you think in the Catholic teaching, as you understand it, that true solidarity must be universal across all groups? Or is it possible? Because occasionally you will get people, Catholics will show solidarity with other Catholics who are suffering persecution elsewhere around the world. Is it possible, if you like, to have that sectoral solidarity? Because the problem is that when people express solidarity with those who they think are like them, then that can suddenly, on a global scale, end up being division with lots of different multiple solidarities and groups being pitted against each other.
Yep. Yeah, it's a topic that hasn't been developed too much in Catholic social teaching. I mean, the main understanding would be that we're called to global solidarity. So therefore, solidarity with all of humanity, and in a particular way with the excluded, with those we tend to consider the other within our own communities, but also throughout the earth. But also a new development that has happened in Catholic social teaching with several authors is to look on what is the foundation of solidarity, what makes us a solidal group, let's say. And the newest answer, the most common answer that continues to come up now is again, what Pope Francis says, we are called to be neighbors to the other. So even if I don't share the experience of oppression of another group, I am called to be neighbor to them and to help them move forward. Just because I didn't have the experience does not exclude me from that group, because also there's that talk about that only people that have suffered a particular oppression can have solidarity among themselves. So again, the tendency is to see, no, it's an open solidarity where all of us are concerned for the other and all of us can collaborate to help others, if not myself, also within the process for a better world, for a better life for each and every one of us.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to all of those watching out there that if you get your questions into us at the end of the presentations, I'll be able to put those questions hopefully to our participants. Let's move on though now to our next speaker. I think that next we will be going to Houston, Texas, indeed, from where we're joined by Ava Thompson, Professor of Slavic Studies Emerita at Rice University, who's the author of a number of books and publications dealing with Russian culture. Ava, please go ahead. Oh, I think you need to unmute yourself, Ava. Sorry, it's somehow we're still on mute. There we go.
How it goes, yes. As I listened to this previous talk, excellent one, I thought of what Fyodor Dostoevsky said. He said that it's easy to love the fellow man who is somewhere in Australia or somewhere that we are not, but it's very hard to love the fellow man that's next to us. So maybe we should start with loving our surroundings first and then go to general humanity. But that's not what I was going to say in my short presentation. I would like to start with something that everyone would agree with, namely that solidarity was a very important factor in the fall of communism. I'm talking about solidarity as the labor movement in the Gdańsk shipyards in the 1980s. And since it was such an important movement, it is rather surprising that it was so quickly forgotten by Western intellectuals and Western academia. If you compare, for instance, the number of books and movies and articles and songs written about the French Revolution of 1968, I call it revolution, but you can call it something else, and solidarity, you will find that the French riots in Paris in 1968 generated much more in way of writing than solidarity. And yet this French revolution, all it did was basically to introduce new social mores, new sexual mores, I should say. And it didn't really influence the humanity at large, whereas the fall of communism was a very important event for everybody, regardless of whether you were under communism or you were not. So the question is, why did it happen? And I would like to propose that this was because of what solidarity was, what solidarity actually represented. And Western intellectuals and Western academia simply didn't like what solidarity represented. And what did it represent? What were the three structural elements of solidarity? Well, the first one was economic. Of course, workers under communism were underpaid. Everybody knows that. They were malnourished. And if prices were to be raised again, as the party said they would go into another stage of malnutrition because everybody under communism was malnourished. There was bread there, but very little else. So there was the economic reason for solidarity to come about. And that's something that everybody would accept. But there were other reasons, two other reasons. The second was nationhood. Those workers knew that their country was occupied by a foreign power at the end of World War II. They knew that the government in Warsaw was subservient to the government in Moscow, and they didn't like it. They had the national solidarity, and I don't think we should reject nationhood right from the very beginning and say that this is something that makes us less capable of loving humanity. This is the way, the natural way for human beings to organize into groups, into nations. So the workers had this nationhood as an element of their solidarity. And then there was the third element, and that was the religion. Those workers were Christians. They were Catholics. And they felt that what was being done to them was not just disadvantageous to them personally, but it was wrong. It was against the Ten Commandments. It was something that they felt was done against the very basic laws that should prevail in society. And this feeling that of moral superiority, which they felt, which they had over their oppressors, was a very important element of solidarity. So we have those three factors, out of which two are totally unacceptable for Western intellectuals who are left-leaning, as we know. Academia is left-leaning, and this is the reason why solidarity was almost forgotten. If you look at books about the 1980s, you'll find maybe one paragraph about solidarity, and that's it. And what is very characteristic is that the great books on solidarity that were written in the 1990s, again, were completely forgotten. I have in mind, for instance, a book by Lawrence Goodwin, Breaking the Barrier, published by Oxford University Press. Tremendous book. One of the best books I've read on social movements. And Lawrence Goodwin was, he's dead now, Lawrence Goodwin was the world specialist, the world authority on mass movements. And according to him, mass movements happen very seldom, and they should be studied very carefully because they are extremely important in the development of humanity. Well, this book was not even reviewed in Slavic Review, which is the American foremost journal on Slavic affairs, where all kinds of junk is being reviewed, written by professors who just want to get tenure and promotion. So that's very, very important to remember that the best book on solidarity was not even reviewed in many journals that should have reviewed it. there were other books that were written at the same time also. Well, they did receive the reviews, but it wasn't really enough to bring solidarity back into the mainstream studies. So what was the case in academia was also duplicated in political life. I would like to submit to your consideration that there were many politicians in the West that really didn't like solidarity. It was a headache. It was an unnecessary headache. In Western Europe, the sailing was good. The boat was sailing smoothly. Western Europeans had the American umbrella, military umbrella over them. They were separated from communism by this string of states that, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so forth. And life was good. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want upheavals. They didn't want problems to deal with. Solidarity was a problem. And as I recall, towards the end of the 1980s, when communism was actually falling apart, there were discussions in public in the United States on our PBS program, which is our cultural program, non-commercial. There were many politicians who were actually saying, oh, this is terrible. We must sort of suppress it because the entire system will break down. And I recall Richard Pearl, who was an advisor to several presidents. And actually then later on, he was the architect of the war in Iraq. But Richard Pearl discussing things on PBS and saying it was the time when Bush and Gorbachev were meeting somewhere, and the commentators were just talking about, what will be the result of these of this meeting. And Richard Pearl said, but if that happens, then those countries may get rid of the Soviet domination. I'm not quoting literally because I don't remember it, but I have those things written down. I can quote chapter and verse. So here's Richard Pearl, who's publicly confessing, gosh, I want this solidarity to be suppressed. I don't want it. This is no good. We are here sailing very well. The sailing is good. So what I would like to submit is this, that both in academia and in the political world, solidarity was actually unwelcome in the Western world, politically speaking. And it was unwelcome because it had, out of these three foundational elements which it brought forth, two were unacceptable to the both academia and to a certain part, I'm not saying to everybody, to a certain part of the political world. Obviously, President Reagan was not in that group, and he was very helpful and so forth. But what's the conclusion then of all this? It seems to me that the conclusion is that perhaps it is time to stop blaming nationalism and religious engagement for all kinds of bad things that happen in the world. Perhaps we should rephrase or refashion our way of looking at nationhood and at religious loyalty, which people have, and maybe reintroduce it into politics, not as bad things, but as something that has to be, sorry, that has to enter our thinking and our writing and our outlook on the world. Did it take up anything? Okay.
That's fine, Eva. Thank you for that memory of Richard Pearl. I seem to remember he used to have the nickname the Angel of Death back in the day, I think, in relation to his attitude to the Cold War at that particular point. also liked your quote from Dostoevsky, because I think Charles Dickens had a similar concept. He had a concept of telescopic philanthropy, as he used to put it. You could be philanthropic to people on the other side of the world, but not so much to you. Just one question from me before we move on. You talked about the sort of the moral authority that Solidarność had in terms of their sense of right. Was that what contributed to their victory in the end, or was it just basically power politics that already the Soviet bloc from Mikhail Gorbachev downwards was already kind of like on the way towards, I suppose, a much lesser sense of its power and its willingness to be ruthless in intervening? I mean, I'm thinking about current politics, whatever's going on in, say, Belarus or Hong Kong. If you're up against an authority that use ruthless violence against you, moral authority only goes so far.
Well, you've got two good examples here. It's hard to say. I mean, I would say that in the Polish case, it was definitely Catholicism that helped those people. In the case of Belarus and Hong Kong, obviously not quite that, rather secular. However, those things in Hong Kong and Belarus are not over. It is just Act 1. So I would not pronounce on that yet. But when it comes to solidarity, it's an amazing kind of combination: nationalism, Catholicism, and economy. This is what made solidarity so strong. It's true, it was defeated. However, maybe this is the natural way for human beings to organize, and maybe we should study it more rather than condemning it in a way that is rather unnecessarily speedy. And when it comes to Belarus, actually, I just wrote about that, and the element of nationhood, which is very much present in those demonstrations. You just have two elements there. One is economic, the second is national in Belarus. And it's not democracy they are fighting. Of course, they want democracy, but this is something that would come with freedom, they assume. Freedom contains democracy. They're fighting for freedom. They're fighting for liberty. And they want their nation, Belarusian nation, to be finally recognized as a nation. Whereas Western comments about that say that, well, they are trying for a democratic society. The word democracy has lost its steady meaning. It sort of became wobbly. You can use it any way, and it will always fit into any system. So what I think is that whereas there is no religious element in, at least I don't see it yet, in Belarus and Hong Kong, they may be going the way of solidarity, and this religious element may appear eventually. I don't know. That's something to be seen.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on now to Istanbul, from where we are joined by Deniz Arabogan. Deniz is Professor of International Relations at Istanbul University, teaches courses related to international security and terrorism. She's a commentator on TV and in the newspapers. In 2013, she was the chair of one of a number of regional Wise Peoples Committees. These were designed to play a supportive role in the so far unsuccessful peace process involving Turkish and Kurdish leaders. She's also a founding member of the Turkish Business Women's Association. Deniz, welcome to the webinar. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a great pleasure to take part in CDBPB events, and I would like to extend my warm thanks to the coordinators of this meeting before I start. And of course, our special appreciation goes to Eva Grossman. I would like to concentrate more on the solidarity in COVID times in my presentation. And let me start my piece by one of the most famous opening lines of English literature from Charles Dickens's great novel, A Tale of Two Cities. It says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. What a wonderful description of the psychology of the times of revolution and change during the 19th century. An atmosphere which is very much like today's environment. Pessimistic psychology filled with the past memories of Spanish flu, Black Death, and other pandemics of history, together with an ongoing risky and dangerous daily life, and also an ambiguous and foggy future without knowing what to expect. However, we all know that there's still an opportunity to open the gates of heaven, as there are enormous risks for going directly to hell. This infamous phrase was also taken by China's President Xi Jinping at the Davos meeting in 2017. At those times, there were no viruses, no pandemic, no economic, social, and psychological traumas related to it. However, today billions of people are living under strict conditions, faced with several risks, not only about health issues, but also economic, financial, psychological, and political threats. As we live in a world that has become increasingly interconnected and interdependent, dealing with a pandemic in such an environment is extremely difficult. Systemic vulnerabilities and uncertainties pose a great danger to the ecosystem that we exist within. Most of us are scared, anxious, oppressed, desperate, lonely, and helpless. In fact, we were very hopeful when the 21st century began with great expectations. 20 years ago, at the United Nations Millennium Summit, the future goals were identified as eradicating extreme poverty, promoting gender equality and empowering women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. These were the main concerns of that time. There were no Islamic terrorism, no Trump, no rising China, no pandemic, no risk of global and financial collapse. In those days, having become the majority in intellectual and academic circles, liberals claimed that a global society was achievable, that a system of common norms and values could be built, and that differences could be considered as richness. The so-called global citizens of the world who share similar tastes in music, kitchen, art, or fashion would also share the same fears, anxieties, and problems. So it would be very normal to hope this would lead to the construction of a new political architecture for a better future in solidarity. It was expected that the unstoppable globalization would pave the way for a universal peace, end all wars, and bring about the end of history, for sure with the help of global regimes, norms, and institutions. Unfortunately, this illusion didn't last long. The first global crisis of the millennium broke out on the 11th of September in 2001 with a massive terrorist attack. It was a day of unprecedented shock for the global audience, and by a series of Al-Qaeda attacks, which came after the first hit, killed thousands of innocents while causing massive destruction throughout the world. And it was not a surprise to see how all agendas of high and low politics went into a securitization process. Ideals related to human rights, democratization, liberal values, global governance, or sustainable peace thrown away. Then comes the second global crisis of the century in 2008, the global economic crash, which was triggered by a combination of speculative activity in the Western financial markets, focusing particularly on property transactions, metamorphosed to the greatest disaster of the global economic system of the world, and the world has ever witnessed since 1929. Although the epicenter of the collapse was United States at the beginning, eventually the impact spread around the world in a very short period of time. The path to global recovery was rugged, and the damage compelled the governments to adopt their policies to the new dynamics of global economy, which hardly fits with liberalization strategies. And then the third big global crisis of the 21st century started with the notification of Chinese authorities of an outbreak of a new disease, which was later named as COVID-19. Although at the beginning it was believed to remain a local problem like SARS, it was soon understood that this new disease is the most serious health crisis the world is facing since the Spanish flu of 1918. As the disease emerged in a very crowded and high-tech city of China, which was deeply interconnected with the global system, the speed of the pandemic spread was extremely high. However, the response was two-faced. On one side, hypermodern, and on the other, practically medieval. While the scientists tried to sequence the genome of the coronavirus and share the information about its virulence in collaboration with other scientists of the world within solidarity, the governments preferred to shut down their societies, close the borders, and isolate their countries from others. Self-help system became the most favorable strategy for all the statecrafts. Contrary to what was hoped in the 21st century, came with global, political, economic, humanitarian, and health crisis. While the first global crisis helped changing our perception of security, the second one collapsed our confidence in liberal capitalist system, and the third seems to change how we live, work, and relate to each other. Furthermore, our bonds with political authorities under the mass surveillance systems. For me, from all aspects, economic, social, political, and humanitarian cost of the pandemic is the worst of all the crises. Despite the development of modern technology and globalization rhetoric that speeds up human and social life more than ever and unites its common destiny, the most prominent feature of the COVID-19 era is the lack of solidarity and cooperation. International institutions like UN or EU couldn't develop any serious initiatives like medicine supply, coordination of humanitarian aid, or economic support during this global crisis. Even the leading institution, WHO, became a tool for political conflicts and reckoning. And the COVID crisis turned into a propaganda war, and all the psychopolitical weapons are being used for even domestic purposes. The abuse of pandemics also created an enormous amount of deliberate misinformation about the crisis, its origins, and its eventual consequences. Several conspiracy theories were produced to identify the enemy, while spreading mistrust in public institutions. They also spread mistrust in scientific and medical institutions too. At this point, let me remind you who's warning about the outbreak of infodemics. The story is like, there's no such thing as coronavirus, or the virus is a biological weapon developed by the United States, by China, by Israel, or by Bill Gates, who already produced the vaccine and going to make billions from this crisis, received too much attention. Depending on who you are talking to, stories point out different scapegoats. In some countries, conspiracy theorists have gone so far as to attack mobile phone towers with the blame that the virus is spread by 5G systems. According to Trump, with reference to Pompeo, Americans are still wearing masks and watching the pandemic's body count rise because the Chinese Communist Party failed in its promises to the world. And the name of the virus is for sure Chinese virus. The politicization of COVID-19 risks are also being used to create heroic narratives, as in the case of China, which has moved on from being the cause and epicenter of the disease, being perceived as the one who won the battle against it and currently the strongest supporter of the helpless countries affected by the virus. But here comes the question again. Are shipments of essential medical products a form of altruism or solidarity or something more self-serving and even sinister? And let's put some additional questions. Are the nation states or politicians or societies really want to cooperate against this threat? When there's a common enemy, will it promote cooperative actions or consolidate self-help mechanisms? When a global crisis arises in the future, through which channels and ways will these crises be handled? Which institutions will determine the agenda of international cooperation and coordination? Who will cover the financing of the institutions and mechanisms responsible of coordination, distribution, arbitration, and mediation of the processes? Are we going to trust these kind of solidarity and cooperation mechanisms under the shadow of political ambitions and well-designed conspiracy theories? Are we ready to share the good and the bad together? Unfortunately, my answers to these questions are not positive. The COVID doesn't seem to bring us together in solidarity, instead tearing us apart by forcing a paradigm shift from a global understanding of fighting against global threats to abusing every crisis for individual expectations and selfish ambitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Denise, for that very thought-provoking presentation. And you also got some more Charles Dickens in there, which is we've got Dostoevsky and Charles Dickens a couple of times. I mean, you said that there was, if you like, this dichotomy between individual nation states shutting down and then the whole business of sort of international cooperation in terms of the scientific search for a vaccine and for other remedies. In a way, isn't it natural at a time of crisis that you will have this mixture, as you were saying with Dickens, in terms of the best times and the worst times, that you'll have this mixture of people looking out for their own self-preservation, their own self-interest, at the same time not being averse to extending solidarity to others, provided it doesn't cost them too much?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the basic questions of the IR disciplines. It is the first great debate of our field of study. Idealism versus realism. If states and nation states would prefer to help themselves, or will they help on the other nations too? Is it going to lead to a cooperative fight against the threat, or is it going to divide all the nation states from each other? Actually, the times that we are living is not very hopeful for the future about this cooperation, international regimes and institutions. Let me remind you one fact, that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall was collapsed, there were only a dozen of border walls in the world. And when the wall was torn down by the people, we hope that there's not going to be any walls again. We're going to have a global village and we're going to live in peace and everything. Now, today, in today's world, there are 77 countries who are building border walls to their countries. I mean, we're not living in a world without wars. We're living in a bordered, walled world. So in the spirit of time, of course, changed. This is a concrete phenomenon. It's a fact that the states are building walls to their borders. Before, we were trying to tear down these walls. So I'm not hopeful in the very near future, actually. I think the self-help mechanisms will gain more power, it seems to me. I'm a little pessimistic in that case.
You're welcome, of course, to visit Belfast and come and see our wall. Maybe you've done that already.
I've already seen it, actually.
It's still there all these years after the ceasefires. But let's turn now to our next and final speaker for this webinar, who is Michal Gierich, a political scientist and associate professor at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. Michal is the deputy editor-in-chief of the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, Christianity, World Politics. Michal, please give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have this possibility to listen to you and to share with you some thoughts. I would start with the very maybe paradoxical assumption, because the very idea of looking for some kind of solidarity movement legacy in modern politics can be perceived as quite paradoxical. So at least taking stand of political theory, it can be claimed that solidarity doesn't fit to political categories. Modern political science follows Max Weber's view that in the final analysis, the modern state can be defined only sociologically by the specific means that are peculiar to it as to every political organization, namely physical violence. Consequently, politics means the strive for a share of power or to influence the distribution of power. In other words, power is made a central, if not the only, determinant of the politics. In that context, the theory of Carl Schmitt may be seen as a complement to the modern logic in viewing the political life. It identifies the politics with the irremovable conflict between us and them. In that perspective, the politics becomes constituted as soon as we start looking at one another in the categories of friends and enemies. Polish experience of solidarity was at odds with both those modern, widely shared assumptions of what is political. Even if it was a massive social movement aiming at fundamental political change, in its first phase, so till the enforcement of martial law, it didn't strive for power. So in 1980s, in 1980 and 1981, it was very clear that the issue of power is a kind of taboo, is non-extendable border of any kind of expectations and demands, because direct questioning of political monopoly of Communist Party will end up with military intervention of Moscow. That kind of axiom kept the social energy from transforming into some kind of political force and directed it towards taking responsibility for social life. As Father Józef Tischner, a chaplain, philosopher, a real teacher of solidarity, said, I quote, "The forest fights its opponents by growing." End of quotation. Consequently, something unique developed in the time of the first Solidarity. One of the outstanding Polish sociologists, Edmund Wnuk-Lipiński, calls the experience of early 80s in Poland as ethical civil society. So such kind of civil society in which the dominant motive behind the activities of people engaging in public affairs are ethical norms, not individual or group interests. Polish society, somehow ignoring the official authorities and acting in accordance to fundamental moral principles, took responsibility for the local environment as well as for the common good of the entire national community. One can say that it was a time of national moral conversion, what moved George Weigel, for example, to name that peculiar Polish experience a moral revolution. Moral revolution, which was bringing, and it is quite common motive in all memories of the time, experience of real freedom. Solidarity experience, however it could sound strange, was also in odds with Schmittenian vision of conflict between us and them. Of course, it was clear that communism was an enemy, but everyone, also members of Communist Party, were invited to above-mentioned process of moral conversion. Irena Lipowicz, who was PhD candidate, as PhD candidate, entered Solidarity in the 80s, and who was Polish ombudsman for many years, notes that, and I quote, "At the core of the Solidarity paradigm was the inclusion, not the exclusion, forgiveness, not the rejection. The magic formula was the call of the demonstrators, come with us, which was directed even to militarized police forces. So access to solidarity sanitized the previous life." The Polish philosopher Zbigniew Stavrowski, for whom also the experience of solidarity was kind of formative experience, notes, "The experience of the first solidarity is the experience of the community of all those who saw that it is possible to live according to their conscience and decided to live this way." End of quotation. If we take into account that the outbreak of solidarity took place spontaneously, there was no ideology of solidarity, no prepared leaders, etc., the question appears how it was possible. It seems that such a sudden explosion of positive creative energy suggests that solidarity did not need ideology or preparations because its roots were much deeper. It was not an accident that solidarity starts 1 year after the first visit of John Paul II to Poland. There are good sociological interpretation of meaning of a papal visit. There are some good political one, but taking into account shortly described patterns of first solidarity, it is very clear that the crucial issue was exactly religious and moral dimension of that visit. If, for example, Weigel claims, words of Paul II in 1979 has shaken with the fundaments of communist system, it happens exactly because of his call to moral and spiritual revival. That national retreat connected with so-called confirmation of history performed by John Paul II opened a new space in which solidarity could spring into being. I would then say that solidarity could be ethical and inclusive movement, and in a sense natural movement, exactly because it was breathing the Catholic air, which by centuries was inseparable from Polish atmosphere. And then the question comes how to understand the political victory of 1989 and following radical political change from the perspective of solidarity legacy. One group of answers tends to identify the victory of democracy with the victory of solidarity spirit, claiming that internal freedom expressed by solidarity was in a way materialized in Polish politics after 1989 by freedom guaranteed by liberal democracy. They to some extent do see fulfilling of solidarity legacy in the democratic freedom. The second group of responses recognizes that liberal democracy destroyed solidarity spirit and nothing has been left of the solidarity experience. In that perspective, a political victory of solidarity, defeat of communism, means a spiritual defeat of solidarity itself. Supporters of that approach say that solidarity was kind of miracle which cannot be explained or followed. Although it should be admitted that the expectation of constant carnival of solidarity within democracy seems to be utopian, it is difficult to agree that the idea of redundancy of the heritage of solidarity for contemporary politics, or simply fulfilling it by liberal democracy, can be accepted. It seems that the problem with noticing its meaning is due to the fact that we expect either too much or too little. Too much when we dream about the replacement of civil society with ethical civil society. Too little if we want to say that existence of normal civil society makes that ethical experience not important. In my opinion, legacy of solidarity is neither fulfilled nor redundant. It can play and plays to some extent important, above all, corrective role in contemporary politics. I do not mean here, first of all, economical issues. In the perspective of political theory, solidarity experience urges us to accept that politics should to be reflected on the two dimensions. Narrow one, connected with the strive for power, and wide, connected with common good. And that parting of those two ways means, in the end, that political powers enslave citizens. Saying it differently, it recalls the fundamental role of moral core of politics. The events of 1989, John Paul II points in Centesimus Annus, are the warning to those who, in the name of political realism, wish to banish law and morality from the political arena. It seems that at the time when the most fundamental anthropological boundaries are undermined within the framework of liberal democracies, and consequently the moral rules are becoming a morality policy, it is the heritage of solidarity that may support the correction of the totalizing tendencies of contemporary politics. There is also another remark of John Paul II important in the respect of solidarity legacy in politics. He says, I quote, "The struggle which led to the changes of 1989 in a central sense was a struggle born of prayer, and it would have been unthinkable without trust in God, the Lord of the history who carries the human heart in his hands." End of quotation. The experience of solidarity calls for a question about the effects of secularization of contemporary politics. It's worth noting, for example, that the European Union also grew up of Christian solidarity inspiration. In Schuman thought, we discover many elements convergent with the logic of Polish solidarity, conviction about the importance of forgiveness, reconciliation, reference to God and Christian brotherhood, also attempts to bracket the logic of political, etc. However, it is not difficult to see that with increasing secularization of European politics, we seems to be less and less capable of fulfilling the basic requirements of solidarity. And then the final issue. Solidarity was a lesson of importance of small acts of fidelity in that what could be seen as not important matter. Solidarity recalls the importance of grassroots work, encourages the building of small communities, ordinary interpersonal solidarity, as well as taking care of the conditions for their development. The basic condition, and this is what the experience of first solidarity teaches us also, is to cleanse our normal life from the pressures of political conflict. Solidarity teaches that wherever it's possible, one should ignore that narrow political logic in order to give space to this wide, concentrated on common good sense of political life. Therefore, in areas autonomous to power conflicts, in science, culture, art, sport, and all others, consistently apply their appropriate criteria and measures. It can be said that this postulate of kind of depoliticization of public space is a certain minimum program. It seems, however, that in the era when, as political anthropology teaches us, policy has become an increasing central concept and instrument of organization of contemporary societies, also that postulate, rooted in solidarity legacy, seems to be quite demanding. Thank you very much.
Michal, thank you very much for that. couple of things that I take from that is your emphasis on the deep roots of solidarity, because of course it had roots in terms of religion and culture. It wasn't just sort of coming together of people around a specific economic case. And also the interesting thing about not striking for power initially, having, if you like, a more limited goal rather than bringing on a backlash immediately. I mean, if we were to take this into a very different context, I think about the Arab Spring and some of the movements towards the removal of totalitarian regimes there, you would say that some of those motivations were similar in terms of wanting greater freedom. There was also the religious backdrop in as much as Islam was involved there, but it has led by and large to a very different outcome in terms of failure to overturn the regimes or violence or chaos of various kinds. Is there something particularly that you would see in relation to Christianity, or is that kind of nexus of religion and organization something that will can move over into other movements elsewhere?
So I think that the example you mentioned, it's a good example which teaches us that it's not enough to speak about religion, but that there are religions. And each religion has its own quite peculiar attitude towards the relation between religion and politics. And if someone expects, and when we read the, let's say, press from 2011 or 2012, we can see that there was such an expectation that Arab Spring will bring something similar to that what happened in Eastern Europe. Then I would say that it just shows that those persons did not take into account the difference. So it's good that we are aware of the role of the religion, but we have to be aware that there are religions, not a religion, and the political consequences of religion engagement will be different in different religious systems.
Very interesting answer. In Northern Ireland, we sometimes talk about our lessons for other areas, but sometimes you can push the parallels too far. Let's go through some of the questions, because we actually have a rather long list of questions for you. So we'll have to shoot through them relatively quickly. First of all, maybe I'll come to you, Alejandro, as it's been a while since we heard from you. Here's a question from Professor Maragtus Amante in the Philippines. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. He says, solidarity could be culture bound, sometimes bound too much by norms and expectations and movements. The love of Christ through creation is beyond culture and its complications. Shall we find, or how can we find balance? And perhaps if you can take on some of those sentiments, Alejandro.
Okay, if I understood the question, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
So if I understood the question correctly, yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's important for all of us to remember that the word solidarity does not arise from Christianity. It's a word that comes from the world. So basically, the first one was Emil Durkheim in his book in 1892 that writes on the word solidarity, speaking about workers, that because they share a common experience, they feel solidarity. And the language that's always been used in Catholicism and Christianity has been more the language of love and of charity. So not the word solidarity. Solidarity comes very late into our own language. And to say the truth, in Catholic social teaching, it's not until John Paul II in Solicitudo Rei Sociales that uses the word precisely because of the experience of solidarity in Poland, that the vocabulary, the word enters into Catholic social teaching. So that's important to always consider that. Therefore, solidarity goes beyond Christianity. It comes from the secular world, which was also a big crisis for the church itself, because we were mater et magistra. We are the ones that teach the world with the values. We don't really have values to learn from the world. And here was one of those occasions where the word comes from outside. The church had something to learn from outside. It was not completely foreign to what we teach as Christians because it came with charity. So that's one element. The other element, so yes, so these topics of environment, of everything that has to do with the human community are universal values that go beyond culture, religion, and so on. Also, let us not forget that the application of solidarity, I mean, Poland is not the only example. We saw Solidarity already working with Mahatma Gandhi in India, precisely to liberate it from the British Empire, trying to bring people back dignity, etc. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States to bring a minority group to say we are part of the people. We are the people. Who are the people is not just white Americans. It's also African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans. So it's also there. And we saw it in Václav Havel in the Czech Republic. So it's a whole new thing that we've seen in the 20th century, the application of the solidarity in different contexts, in different even religious backgrounds. But having said that, all of these great leaders like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, Lech Walesa, Gene Sharp, Nelson Mandela, etc., there is a spiritual element. There's something that roots them internally. So once they are rooted, they say, I am a human being. I have dignity. Therefore, this is not correct. And therefore, I want to change the situation. And also identify other people that are in the same circumstances. And in the same way, from outside, when we see that, we say, yes, those people are one of us. And therefore, we need to help them in this situation. So yes, I mean, I would be 100% say, yes, the solidarity is universal. What Christianity in particular adds, and Catholicism, is the element of Jesus Christ, in the sense that for us, love and solidarity is giving our entire selves for the other, including those who are not part of our group, even the enemy, as Jesus talks about. So it's what Pope Benedict XVI always called the gift of gratuity, to the point of giving the life for the other. This is a very Christian distinctive aspect of charity and of solidarity, that I would say. And at the same time, it's a universal and human concept.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Ava Thompson, I'll come to you with the next one, because Tony Coyne says, I tend to share Ava Thompson's view. Is it fair to say that this rather haughty view held by academics about solidarity has seeped into the consciousness of the educated younger generation in Poland, and this is now the normative view? After all, Lech Wałęsa was a mere uneducated welder. He's put mere in inverted commas. So some class snobbery and reaction to the views of the previous generation. He wonders if that's what's going on. Ava.
Well, actually, I'm not sure what the question is. And I should add right there at the beginning that Lech Wałęsa has been recently discovered as a not too pure a leader. So that's one thing. His connection to the secret police has actually been deeper than previously thought. And the real leaders of solidarity, Wyszkowski, Walentynovich, Lenarchuk, they've been totally forgotten. I mean, for this panel, I'm sure these names do not mean anything. And yet these were the people that were taking the risks. These were the people that were organizing workers and so forth. So
I suppose boiling it down, Tony's point, he seems to be asking you, do you think that the educated younger generation in Poland look down on solidarity these days? Is that the normal view?
Well, I hate to opine on that, because first of all, I don't live in Poland, so I'm not that, I don't visit that often to form an opinion. I just read the Polish media. I think that what is going on in Poland regarding solidarity, regarding all those great ideals for which solidarity stood, is this: under communism, there was a certain percentage of society that was engaged in the Communist Party, that was engaged in the secret police and their families. And you got several million people of that kind. And these people, after the change of systems, after communism fell, these people actually managed to appropriate for themselves all the Polish media that existed in the country. And these people have had an enormous influence on this new generation that we are here talking about, that supposedly has the, well, not the same views on solidarity that perhaps some of the older people or participants have had. And I think this is one of the legacies of bitter legacies of communism that Poland and other countries have to fight against, because the amount of untruths that have been perpetuated about solidarity and about what they were really fighting for is enormous, and it will take maybe another generation or two to sort it all out. So yeah, I would say from what I read, I see that many young people, just recent events, right, those demonstrations of women with their vulgarisms, many young people are simply not connected to this old world of ideas and honesty and Christianity and so forth. But I think that this is one of the bitter legacies of communism that eventually will sort of fade away because the grandchildren of those people will have access to other information and they will change their minds. So I think this is probably something that that we have to put up with. And this is something that we should count as one of the hateful legacies of communism.
Okay, another question. I'll come to Denise on this. Denise, Louis Vincent Reis, if I've got that right again, says, what is the role of identity politics, for example, in solidarity? Is it a help or a hindrance?
Well, actually, this identity politics is a product of the strongness of identity politics is a product of globalization idea, because this globalization issue disturbed the national citizenship identity from the top as global citizenship and from the bottom as sub-identities. So when it comes to identities in the micro level identities, ethnic identities, sectarian identities, I mean sects, the religious identities, of course, these creates bonds within the groups, the large groups of the religious people, for example, the Christians, the Muslims. Of course, it produced solidarity within the, for example, Islamic groups, the Ikhwan-e-Muslimin, the Wahhabi group, the secular Muslims, the Western Muslims and the Western-oriented Muslims and others. But when we are talking about the groups, the identity groups, we have to understand that solidarity does not necessarily stem from love and togetherness. Sometimes it stems from hate and the other, the identifying the enemy. What brings us shoulder to shoulder? We need to find the other first. We need to find the enemy. So in identity politics, it is divisive character also has a positive notion in bringing the people together. So solidarity does not always bring peace to all the people in the world. Sometimes it divides. In the Warsaw Pact, the nations were in solidarity, and in NATO, they were in solidarity too. Now, when you come to my country, for example, the Muslims, they think that they're isolated from the other world. I mean, they think that the Western people are humiliating them. They think that many of the people in Turkey think that ISIS or Al-Qaeda profile does not represent the Muslim community. But in the Western eyes, everybody thinks that the Muslims are the ISIS people. They are the Al-Qaeda people. And when it comes to these issues, the people in Turkey, in the Muslim communities, people cannot get into solidarity with the other people because they think that they're humiliated. So this kind of identity issues, when you frame a person other than being a human being, like the onion, there are always layers. I mean, in one layer, there's your religion. In the other, there's your ethnicity. In the other, there's your nationality, your gender, these kind of things. I mean, at the core, we're all human beings, but we have dresses. So one day, Turks are a member of the NATO, protecting the southern flank of NATO. The other day, they are the leaders of the Islamists, sometimes terrorists in some others' minds. So I think solidarity has two phases. In one phase, it is love. In the other phase, it is hate. And it has a divisive character too.
Thank you very much, Denise. Michal, maybe you'll take this question. I think it kind of touches on a similar theme to the question that I asked you. Sagar Subaria asks, why all the focus on Abrahamic faiths? Are you saying Hindi, Jain, Buddhist faiths have nothing contribute to the world? The word mantra from Sanskrit was used, but nothing, Sagar says he said nothing about these faiths.
Well, it's a very right question, actually. If the
Oh, right,
question
I
is-
was going to come to Michal, but yeah, give me a brief answer on that, Denise, and then I'll come to Michal.
And yes, if you wish, just start.
That's all right. Well, Denise first, sorry.
Okay, I thought that the question is for me. I mean, there are different religions, there are different belief systems, and there are huge belief systems. But what we read from history is the only Western history, actually. So we are always using the Western perspective in that. That's the reason that we sometimes ignore the other side of the world. Maybe it's a very right complaint.
Michal? Sorry, yeah, you're on.
So I just want to answer very simply that here we were to discuss this legacy of solidarity. That's why the reflection about Abrahamic religions were quite natural. But I think that it's also important to remember that metapolitical ideas in religions differ. And that it does not go like that we can just take the same social or political action and expect that each religion will contribute to that in the same way. So it's enough to take, for example, a Freedom House survey and check which countries are free, partly free and not free. And then compare it with the religious grounds of these countries. And this metapolitical dimension, which I just wanted to mention, is very clear. So some religions support these freedoms and the idea of freedom and of this political system, others not, or not so much. But I want, if I may, also make one remark to Professor Alejandro and Dennis in the context of solidarity. Because, of course, that it's true that solidarity is a term which we can say it's taken from a secular sociological approach of Pierre Leroux or Emile Durkheim. But I would not agree that it is not present in the Christian reflection. So it is not present as a notion. It cannot be present as a notion because the whole moral system founded on St. Thomas Aquinas reflection, there was no place for a distinct virtue of solidarity, as there was no place for the generally distinct social virtues, so to say. Yes. But it's very clear that when Christian reflections take the solidarity notion, it transforms its meaning. So when we read the Leroux texts, it's very clear that solidarity there is understood as, let's say, a way of coping with human egoism. So we are all interconnected, so we can rationally find out that we need each other, and this egoism is a source for our action. In the Christianity, there is a totally different approach to solidarity. So the issue is of caritas. So it's not about egoism, but about caritas. And in this sense, it also shows why we can, these two approaches, which are theoretically grounded, shows maybe, or give some answer to that what Dennis just told us, that we can find understanding of solidarity, which is, let's say, a kind of hate, but in the proper sense, it's not the solidarity in ethical sense of this word. And what I wanted to stress that legacy of solidarity movements was very clearly connected to this ethical understanding of solidarity, which is deeply rooted in Christian reflection, even if really in let's say, Pope's teachings appears from, I think, the Pius XII. I think he's the first one who mentioned solidarity as a notions in a teaching, but I can be wrong. So I can be corrected, but in this sense, it's quite quite new when we take into account the whole history of the Catholic Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes to go. I'll have to get a move on because we've still got lots of questions I'm trying to get through. Alejandra, there are a couple of questions maybe that you could take in a row. One from Andre Yearman, if I've pronounced that correctly, says, thanks for your very inspiring speech on global and local solidarity. I would like to know what you would consider some good on-the-ground practices or examples of such solidarity. I'm part of a Christian democratic political youth organization and would like to implement some sort of practical solidarist community net in my hometown.
I mean, here at the Angelicum, we have the different groups that are working. I mean, I would say that the main question is what I was just looking up the references, Sally Schultz's book, Political Solidarity, which talks about what makes a group a solidarity group, and what it makes it, according to her, which would go within what we think in Catholic social teaching, is the cause. So we are solidarity for what? So which includes people, but it's the cause that unites us to fight an injustice, to fight structures that are out there that somehow do not permit human development. So to form a group, not only a Christian group, but because here we have Muslim students too, we have also Buddhist students, etc., who participate in these groups. What they find in common is a cause. And so either the group that we have here is basically to be in solidarity with women who are oppressed in different contexts, in different religions, in different countries. And so they work together to be able to work through different organizations to fight against, especially violence against women at different levels. So this is the cause that they chose because they felt close to that. So that's how you form solidarity groups. You form because you see, like also in Poland, I mean, it was the workers at the docks that said, we're not being paid, there's injustice here. It's not even respecting what the Soviet constitution said about workers. So that's what we want to change. So that's what unites us. And the interesting thing about Sally C. Schultz's book is that precisely it expands solidarity to everyone. So it's the cause that unites you. So anybody can participate, including, which was very controversial when she published her book, it can also include oppressors. So people who are on the other side that finally see the light. Because that was a question, can we invite an oppressor to, or an ex-oppressor, I should say, to our group of solidarity? And the answer is yes, because they're not uniting with you against this particular situation. So that, I would say, for any group, that's the whole point. It's to find this, what is the injustice? And because we're human, we can only limit ourselves to one or two causes. So that's the thing. I mean, if we were perfect, then we would be in solidarity with every single cause. But and the other element is what Pope Francis says, is dialogue to really understand what is the issue. Because otherwise identity politics come in, misinformation, misperceptions, because the other is always scary for us. So the dialogue is the most important element in any solidal group, to be able to understand itself and also what is the cause they're fighting. And that's what one of the main works we do here is to put the students in dialogue, first of all, to know each other, to come to know each other and where they're coming from and how they can contribute to this wider issue from the different experiences that they bring. So a solidarity group is based on this dialogue, which is a foundation for any kind of solidarity, any kind of relationship.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Eva, I'll ask you to take the next question. This is from Peter Casar-Torregiani, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who says, the reunification of Germany was a brave attempt to change the EU and indeed is the template for global solidarity. Do you agree?
As a template for global solidarity?
The reunification of Germany. So I don't know whether...
I think it's going too far. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, still.
Okay, well, I think it may be going too far. I would say that reunification of Germany was inevitable. This is one nation, and sooner or later, nations want to be together. And again, I stress that nationhood is not something that we should feel is wrong and we should try to abolish, but it's simply something we should take into account, into consideration as we consider human relations around the world. I think the unification of Germany was a right thing, because that's the way nations should function. What happened afterwards may be considered not quite what we expected, but this was again something that without the Polish solidarity would not have happened. With Germans, it actually recognized occasionally when there are official visits, they would say that. The Poles, of course, are very happy about it. But I think that, yeah, it was a step in the right direction. We'll just see how things develop in Europe, because now, as you know, the European Union is in turmoil, and there are two tendencies. One is the Brussels tendency, the unelected officials want to decide, and the other one is the nation states. And again, nation state is not a bad word. For goodness sake, we do not have to consider that as something very wrong. But I would like to add something to the previous discussion, just one sentence, when we're discussing of which religion is actually more helps us more to develop solidarity. I think there is such a concept as natural law in Christianity, and that might solve the problem, some of the problem at least. We're all subject to natural law. So it's not just, while Christianity is certainly conducive to the building of solidarity, I think, natural law tells us that all human beings possess certain tendencies, certain predilections towards the good. And we should base on that when it comes to deciding which group, which religious group can be considered a trustworthy partner. So just introduce the concept of national law, which will solve some of the problems of whether it's Christianity in particular that helps us to organize in a peaceful way or not, or whether other religions are just as good, or at least good to serve the same purpose.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I see Basilio Montero says, Denise Aribogan, brilliant. I don't think that's a question.
Thank you.
He obviously appreciates your contribution so far. This is what I think this might also be from Peter, but I'll put it to you, Denise, and then maybe others can chime in as well. Surely nationalism is developing to support global citizenship. Do the panelists see that there's a need for a new universal declaration on the rights of, at the UN on the rights of nations, as St. John Paul suggested in his 1995 address to the UN in New York? Should such a declaration of UN rights of nations upgrade? Sorry, I'm just having difficulty because a few of the words have gone together, but should it upgrade to the individual petition to individual human rights, legally appealable at law against one's own government? So there was a bit of a confusion there in the writing of that question, but maybe we could, he wants maybe a new UN declaration of human rights that would allow you to legally appeal against your own government.
Well, actually, I wish we can unite under a new universal declaration, but let me tell one fact. United Nations have 5 super nations among 200 nations. Actually, it is nature is not injustice. I mean, in the Security Council, 5 nation states have the power of veto, and the others doesn't have a word to say. I mean, so these kind of status quos are generally designed by the last winners of the last war. So in order to create a universal declaration of human rights or solidarity declaration, we need an equal participation of all the members of the global society. And I think the world is bigger than 5. So I wish we can come together and create such a declaration, but I'm a pro-realist person in the IR discipline, because this is a wishful thinking. I think it is not easy to bring all the nation states and without taking their interests, individual interests into account. It's not easy to bring them under the same umbrella, I think. There's no institution like that, unfortunately.
This can maybe be our final question for Father Crosthwaite and Michal, and maybe I'll get everyone to join in on it. So I think it comes from Jan Volkovsky, who says, how do you see solidarity developing in practice? I think he's saying, is this some kind of a role that can be played here with greater development of the so-called third sector NGOs putting social teaching into action?
Yeah, I mean,
Alejandro, maybe if you want to start.
yeah, so I mean, I would say yes. I mean, it is happening. It's basically it's most of Catholic social teaching calls civil society to be the engineer of solidarity. That's where it starts, and then of course it's in collaboration with different intergovernmental organizations. I mean, right now we're doing a huge project on decarbonization. So the cost of decarbonization, etc., and the environment across nations and across religions and cultures. And so it's basically the local NGOs that are the main source for us of information of where we need to do, because everything has to be looked at globally, but also locally. So we need the NGOs, we need the churches at the local level, the mosque at the local level, the temple at the local level, also collaborating in this dialogue and informing the top organizations of what's going on. And so solidarity is a multifaceted, multi-leveled thing. So again, it's this principle of dialogue. It has to be a horizontal dialogue as well as a vertical sort of dialogue.
Michal, could I get some closing thoughts from you on solidarity in practice now? How it might develop in the future as you see it?
I just wanted to share it a bit during presentation. So I think that, of course, it is one of the aspects of this legacy, which is quite obviously important, that people are doing on themselves something for the common good. Yes, and in this sense, it's something what fits and stems from the solidarity. Yes, and it's somehow inscribed in human nature as a social being. So in this sense, of course, all these actions which even are done by particular groups but have in perspective this common good are somehow connected to solidarity and let's say follow the path of ethical understanding of our common life.
Eva, how would you hope solidarity in politics may develop in the future?
Now, that's a big question. I think that, first of all, there should be more knowledge about what actually happened in the 1980s. And then we can build on that, because the knowledge about what solidarity actually accomplishes is rather slim in the intellectual world and in academia. I would hope that solidarity would remain a beacon as a model of human organization. It is something that was totally peaceful, that had 10 million people at the end, and yet it didn't break one window. And this way of organizing is probably the one that we consider ideal. We want to organize, but we don't want to dislike anybody. We just want to be together. And if solidarity can serve as an example of this kind of organization, that would be its righteous place in history.
And Denise, some final thoughts from you in terms of how solidarity may develop in the future? Will it win out over self-interest, or will this just be a continuing battle?
Well, I think it continued to be a beacon for all the human beings. I mean, solidarity is an ideal. If we can create it, we have to work for it. There is a saying that all the walkers may not get to the last point, but the ones who get to the last points are the ones who continue to walk. So we need to walk. I mean, it's enough, I think. Whether we reach to the point or not, it's not that important. But solidarity is the biggest idea for the human being, I think.
Thank you very much, all. On that note, I think we should draw our webinar to a close. My thanks to our guests, Michal Gierich, Eva Thompson, Alejandro Crosthwaite, and Denise Arabogan, and apologies to you all if I have mangled the pronunciation of your names during this webinar. My thanks also to Eva Grossman from the Centre for Democracy and Peace Building for all her hard work in organising this discussion behind the scenes. Lord Alderdice will be back in the chair for our next webinar on the application of solidarity to issues of equality and social justice. But for now, from me, Mark Devonport, thank you for joining us and goodbye.